You are listening to And If Love Remains, a unique show spotlighting people, ideas, science, culture, and art. Your host, Mike Lovett.
Yes, Rachel, you are in fact listening to And If Love Remains, and you are indeed speaking to Mike Lovett and my co-host, the maestro of music himself, the man, the machine, the legend, Dr. Elias Axel Pedersen. Welcome back, Elias.
Mike, great to be back. I'm excited about today's show.
I am too. We have on the line and here to talk to us, Mr. Maxwell Brown. Max is the manager at IPAM, which is the International Piano Archives at Maryland. And he's been there for over 20 years. And it's such a wonderful resource for people who are interested in piano literature, for players, scholars. I mean, it's a wonderful resource. We're really excited to have you on, Max. Welcome to the show.
Hey guys, thank you. It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. I want to get started. We were just talking a little bit off air, and I was wondering a little bit about your background and kind of how we talked about being flexible as musicians a little bit.
Yeah.
And talk a little bit about your background, your story, and how you started working with IPAM.
Okay, yeah, let's see if I can give a condensed version. But essentially, I did not come from, I would say, a musical or, let's say, cultured family in that sense. I was directed by my mom, myself, my older brother and older sister, to take music lessons one summer, just as, one of those things where it's like, okay, you guys aren't going to just sit around the house all summer, so you got to figure out something to do. So how about music lessons? Oh, okay, why not? And so I actually took to it rather quickly. So I started late. I started when I was 11 years old playing the piano. And I really took to it immediately. And I remember pretty early on in my studies, I was doing the Chopin C minor prelude. It's the one with the slow one with the chords.
Yeah.
And my teacher, she was actually an organist, but she always saw my enthusiasm for music. And so one time she played me a recording of not just that prelude, but all of the preludes played by Arthur Rubinstein. And I basically just about fell off my chair. I'd never heard anything like that before. I didn't know who Chopin was before I started playing this prelude. And so really, I would say throughout my life, inspirational performances by great performers, that's always been a driving thing. It's always been an inspiration for a piece I wanted to learn. It's been an inspiration for, how I thought about music. And so I would say that that's the beginning. I ended up studying at the Peabody Conservatory, and then I did my master's at the University of Maryland. And actually, before I started at Maryland, I had heard of the piano archives, and through a friend, and this mutual friend, Elias, would know who this is. We were just mentioning him, and he said, "Oh, you have to meet this guy Don Manildi, who's the curator of IPAM. He knows everything." And so, well, let me back up actually just a little bit and say, I always was an avid listener. And I remember I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. I remember going to the Yale Music Library and also the New Haven Public Library and putting on LPs and all sorts of other things and just familiarizing myself with the piano repertoire and different performers.
Mm-hmm.
I think a pivotal time for me in terms of inspiration and this is, I've heard countless people say this, is it happened when I read The Great Pianist by Harold Schoenberg. I don't know, Elias,
Yeah,
did
I've
you
read
read
that. I
that?
have that. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that's a great book.
Many of the people that I've encountered who have an interest in historical recordings and performance, they said, "Oh, when I read Harold Schoenberg's The Great Pianist, that was it for me," and because it really introduced you to this whole world of pianists who were no longer playing, of course, when many of whom were not playing at that time. And it just kind of was this window into the past, and just the way he described, Rachmaninoff playing and Hoffman playing, it just made you want to listen to them. And when you listen to them, like, wow, it was really something unlike, what I love the recordings that I was listening to, and I still do, but it really was, it added another dimension to things.
Mhm.
Um, so I say that to say that sort of spurred my interest in IPAM even before I started working there. This mutual friend said, "Oh, there's this place IPAM at the University of Maryland, and this guy Don Manilda, he's just really great." And so I did
He's sort of
remember.
a walking encyclopedia.
Oh
If you,
goodness.
yeah. Yeah.
Yes, that's putting it. Yeah, yeah, very much so. I think everyone would agree with that. And so, yeah, I remember when I went, I listened to the Liszt concertos being played by Emil von Zauer, who was a Liszt pupil. And of course, this is going back to, and this dates me, of course, this is going back to the late 90s when, there were some historical recordings that were available, but there was still an awful lot that was not available. And you had to go
Mhm.
certain places to listen to them.
Mhm.
So I remember at that time I listened to that and got to meet Don. And then, of course, uh, as I pursued my studies at Maryland, I was a part-time student worker at IPAM. And the rest is history. I mean, I could kind of morph into me being a full-time employee there.
So talk about IPAM itself. Like, what is it? What what kind of resources does it provide for people, and what's unique about it as an institution?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll just piggyback off of that last aspect of your question and say that it really is a totally unique institution. It's really uh, one of a kind institution in terms of bringing together, all relevant material related to the history and the preservation of piano performance. I should say classical piano performance because we don't have jazz and things like that there. Um, and so it brings together, um, all relevant material that we can get our hands on. I mean, there's no way of literally obtaining everything, but the collection is vast. And again, as I've said, it's the only one of its kind anywhere in the world. So just to give you a brief outline um, of what we have at IPAM, very brief. Um, I guess you can break it down into maybe three or four big categories. Let's say, so the first one would be the score collection. Now, let me, maybe I'll preface everything by saying this. I understand in the day that we live in today that a place like IPAM, we have a lot of, I know there's this immense availability in the world today, just digitally, with YouTube and with IMSLP and other resources like that. And
Mhm.
most people are like, oh, well, what do I need to
Get
go
it
to a
online.
library or whatever for to uh, do research or to, So we definitely have a niche, and that niche is with very interested, enthusiastic scholars, researchers, people like that who understand that there still is a lot of primary source material, original material uh, that's housed in institutions, certainly like IPAM, that's still not available anyplace else.
Gotcha.
and it brings it all together. So for instance, we have a vast score collection, and no, not everything is on IMSLP. We still regularly get requests for scores that people can't find elsewhere. We just was just corresponding with someone just these past few days, and he's wanting to create a score of a series of pieces by Thalberg,
Okay.
and he found some of the scores on IMSLP, but not all of them. But we had all of them, and so I sent him the scores. We have a wide ranging selection of materials. I would call them performer collections. I mean, performer editions, I would say. And now, so we're all familiar with something like Schnabel's edition of the Beethoven sonatas. And, we're living in a day where there's a little bit more interest than there used to be in gleaning the insights of these great performers and their editorial ideas about some of these great pieces. And so we would have a wide range of uh, these out of print editions by great performers, like Rosenthal or Goldenweiser or Ignaz Friedman. Of course, Courteau's, a lot of Courteau's stuff is very much available today.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have
Salvaire
things,
editions. Yeah.
yeah. So we have things like that. So that would be the score, and we also have a lot of unique out of print scores, transcriptions, just you know a vast
Yeah.
range of transcriptions. And again, that's something that's becoming a lot more in vogue than it used to be.
Can I
So
ask a quick thing, just
yeah.
since we're on the score issue? Um, are you worried, or is there a worry that somebody might get their hands on one of these scores, which is not in the public domain yet or not available, and just scan it and upload it? I mean, is that a problem? Are there copyright issues around some of these older scores or artist scores?
Again, I think they, at this point, you're talking about, in terms of the editions that I'm thinking of, you're talking about things that are 75 years, 100 years, 125 years old.
Okay,
So
so
I
there are
would
no
imagine
issues.
most of them would be in the
In
public
the public
domain, and
domain, yeah.
people, and again, when we, what people decide to do with material,
Mhm. You can't
uh,
always control that. Yeah.
not really, not really.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so there's the scores. Another component I would say would be the performer collections, and these would be the actual collections of various pianists, people like some of the more famous collections we have at IPAM: William Capell, Leopold Godofsky, Earl Wild, Raymond Lewenthal. You can go on and on. We have something approaching around 100 performer collections, and in these cases, these would be in most cases, the actual physical materials that belong to these performers. So there could be letters there,
Mhm.
diaries,
Oh, wow.
um, publicity photos, informal snapshot photos, their score collections, sometimes unpublished recordings. So it's the whole range, and it really depends. Um, concert programs. And so generally with the performer
Oh,
collections,
that's exciting. Yeah.
it's fantastic. Generally with the performer collections, the interest in them is from scholars who in a lot of cases are let's say researching to write a book. And so there would be primary source material there that again you can't find anywhere else. Now I'll just say with that the material comes to us in the state that it, whatever state it was in, that's what we have. So it's not necessarily a case that a certain performer retained everything from their concert career. I mean, they might have tossed a lot of stuff, or so it varies. I mean, in some cases there's a lot there, in some cases there are gaps, in some cases there's not so much, but maybe it's still unique.
With the paraphernalia of very famous people, I remember one thing that I actually never saw there was Liszt's hair, I believe. So a lock. I mean, are those part of that artist collection? Are those kinds of
I'm sorry, I
items?
missed that last little
Oh,
bit, Elias.
List. Remember, I think List a lock of his hair or something is
Yes,
encased in some glass, and it's
yes.
in a temperature controlled room or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, and there are plans to harvest the DNA to bring Franz Liszt back. That's one of our projects. So no,
Right on. We'll get Elon right on that.
Yeah. Right.
yeah, no, that's true, Elias. There was a Liszt exhibit that we put on. Oh my goodness, I don't remember how many years ago now, but yes, there was a framed photo, and I think there's a letter in there, and there's a lock of Liszt hair. But here's the funny thing about it. We actually, subsequent to that, got another lock of Liszt's hair.
Oh,
And that,
really?
yes, that the one you're talking about is when, kind of those pictures of Liszt when we think about when he is more of an elderly man and he has kind of a salt and pepper, graying hair. And so the lock looks like that. But this other lock, we got through a collection, the collection of Emil Dannenberg, who was the dean of Oberlin for many years, and I have no idea. It's really encased in this old crusty box, and there's a note attached, and all. Of course, we're assuming all of this is thoroughly authentic, but
Right.
it's a
Provenance.
small lock of it's
Yeah.
a small lock of Liszt hair, and it kind of has this chestnut brown color. It was a lock taken when he was about 16 years old.
Oh, okay.
So,
Wow.
that's very interesting. I mean, we don't. I wish we had more things like that, but we don't necessarily specialize in artifacts, let's say. But occasionally we do get odd things like that come in the collections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool.
And I real quick, I guess the last thing the last area I would highlight would be the recordings, and that's something that's really. I don't know. I shouldn't say it's more important than the other ones, but it seems to be at the forefront of a lot of what we do. And, we have, I would say, certainly the most vast, comprehensive collection of piano recordings anywhere. And that would start with the 78 RPM records, the LPs, we try to keep up on CDs, but we're not going to get everything. We try to. Um, and so if someone privately publishes something, like Elias had to give us his CDs, I had to hound him to make sure he gave us his CDs, because we want to have stuff like that. But if someone just publishes something like that, we would have no way of knowing. And
Uh,
so we try to keep up on that. And there are thousands of reel-to-reel tapes, cassette tapes, and I highlight all of that because many of these recording media, contain materials that are unique. Sometimes they're radio broadcasts, sometimes they're live performances, and trust me, there are many, many, many thousands of them. So of course we haven't heard most of them. There's so much there that's never been unearthed and published or so
Is
there's a
there
lot
a process to I mean, not just the recordings, obviously everything other than the lock of hair, I suppose, could be digitized, but maybe someday Elon will figure that out too. I don't know, but
right.
um, what like is there a process of trying to get to all these recordings and digitize them and make them a little bit more age proof, I guess?
Yeah, there is, and and that's one of
Takes
the
funding.
challenges we face, because we're pretty, to say the least, we're pretty short staffed at IPAM, with the curator Don Manildi and myself. We're the only full-time staff. We have a student worker helping us out right now. We haven't had a student worker for years, actually. And we would essentially have to have a full-time engineer to do that kind of digital transfer work to even make a dent in what we have there. And of course, that takes funding. And so that's been one of the challenges over the years, and hopefully sometime soon we'll get over that hurdle, and we'll be able to um, make a dent in that. I'll talk a little bit more about, just some small things that are being done in that area when we get a little bit further down and talk about these selections that I've selected today. But one other footnote that I'll add, well, a couple others. We have a vast book collection, again, including a lot of out of print books, a huge collection of books on list, a vast collection of Russian books, and many other things related to piano playing and things like that. The book collection and the CD collection are cataloged. That means if you were searching for a particular thing in the University of Maryland's catalog, you could search from anywhere, obviously, you would find those things, but the other aspects of our collection, you would have to get in touch with us.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also had a piano roll collection that was pretty extensive, and I remember when I was a student there, the fear was that those would kind of disintegrate after some time, and it takes a lot of time and effort and money, of course, and funding to digitize those. I know you had the player piano there as a Berzendorfer Imperial there,
yes,
to play some of it, but I don't know if a lot of that has been digitized by now, or if some of those scrolls are just getting too old and falling apart, or what's going on?
Well, that was a perfect segue, Elias, because I was just about to mention that. There's a huge fascination with piano rolls. So the way things are set up now, when you walk in the front door of IPAM, the first row of shelves you see, they're loaded with thousands of piano rolls, and people are like, "Wow!" Mm-hmm. Now, the curator, Don Manildi, the founder of IPAM, Gregor Benko, they tend to have a very qualified, I would say, I don't know if appreciation is the right word, but they have a very measured response to piano rolls and their value in terms of actually being documents of the performances of the great pianists. They're not worthless, but there are a lot of qualifications just in terms of what mechanism you have to play them back, the state of the roll. There are a lot of variables that could give you a distorted impression of the rolls. Mm-hmm. Now, I'll say that actually, and I'm going to not say too much, but there is possibly a very major development right around the corner in terms of the preservation and hopefully, maybe,
enhancement or something.
Something. The technology needs to be there, and there needs to be a massive amount of funding. And I'll just say, without saying too much, because not that it's some big secret, but because sometimes there's some kind of looming project. Oh, this is going to happen, and then it either doesn't happen or it's delayed several years or whatever. But we do believe that there's something right around the corner that will be done with the piano rolls in terms of preserving them.
Could you explain, for those of us, for those in the audience that might not know what a piano roll is and how it functions? I mean, I've gotten to see them, and I've gotten to see them played through the Berzendorfer and that you have in other systems. But how do they work? What do they look like?
And actually, as far as I can tell, just being at IPAM, we have a climate-controlled room. It seemed, as far as I can tell, not that anyone has done an extensive analysis, but it seems like their condition is stable. Mm-hmm. I think that they would be fine by and large. They seem to be in good condition, just in terms of any future projects that could extract the performances from them. But a piano roll, it's sort of again, if you think of a scroll, if you think of the ancient world and a book that's a scroll rather than a book. So it's a long sheet of paper wrapped around in sort of a long cylinder, and it unravels. And you put it in a piano that has a mechanism and then the roll has these little holes, these perforated holes that correspond to notes, rhythms, dynamics, pedaling, etc. And you put it in the piano, and the roll unravels, and it's kind of a pneumatic thing where air is blown through the holes. I don't know too much about the actual technical mechanism, but as the roll goes over this I don't know what to call it,
Reader or
um,
something.
yeah, it essentially in a more ancient way, it reads the material, the information on the roll, and sets the keys in motion and plays the piece. So you hear the performance, and you actually see the keys being played. So it's like a ghost is playing the piano. So it does have a certain fascination for people.
It's MIDI before there was MIDI.
Yeah, I thought some of them were more mechanical, and some
Yes.
newer ones. I thought the Börsendorfer had more of a digital reading
Yes.
of it, so it's a little bit more accurate. It's not really going in the holes, or having a metal
Absolutely.
spike that goes. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
We have at this time we have two pianos, and one of them is a Chickering piano that plays um, piano rolls, and then there's the Börsendorfer, which the files are digital in that case. And I don't know, Elias, what you heard, but there, for instance, we did have all of Rachmaninoff's rolls on there, and several other performances, and those are going to tend to sound much more smooth and much more like an authentic performance. So it does give you a glimpse, and those were made, oh goodness, 25, 30 years ago. So it does give you a glimpse of, possibly with newer technology, that you can really produce performances that are, if not completely not authentic, but that bring you closer to an ideal performance.
Yeah.
Well, either way, it's interesting because when you're trying to capture these old performances, you have to sacrifice one thing or the other. It's either you have an old recording, which is difficult to listen to sometimes. Maybe it's bad recording. Maybe there's other the technology wasn't there, or you have these piano rolls, which may be close but not quite what the performance was like, but you get to hear it on new pianos, and
Right.
you have to
You're
play
right.
this game.
And who knows? And again, we have not. I don't know the state of things right now in terms of what people can do digitally with the rolls, but they certainly can make them sound better than just putting them in maybe someone's clunky role player, which a lot of people have produced recordings like this, and they
foot
think
powered piano.
yeah, not much better than that. I mean, and they think, oh, this is Rachmaninoff playing, and it's like, well, so they are there's much more that can be done. And again, I'll say that hopefully soon we'll be able to report on some movement in that direction to do something about the rolls.
That's exciting.
I
have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Mike. Yeah.
Well, I before we get into like recording some other things, and this is really a question both for Elias and Max. As performers, I wanted to talk about the score collection and also the transcription collection, which is an interesting thing to me because when I think of transcriptions, as when I play jazz, a lot of times I'm taking recordings that were done as an improv and then trying to transcribe what they did.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, is when you're talking about transcriptions, is that similar where you're taking a performance, a classical performance, and trying to maybe a cadenza or something that trying to replicate on paper what a performer did? And how is that useful as a performer?
Do you want to answer that, Elias?
I can answer part of it. I think and then you can kind of fill in. I think there's a little divide in maybe the meaning of the term transcription from the jazz to the classical world. So when we're talking about in jazz transcribing something from a recording, that's exactly what it is. You're listening to the recording, trying to write down exactly what they played so you can play it. But in classical literature, people like Liszt and Thalberg, they made piano transcriptions, which are basically piano versions of other pieces that they had heard. So they might,
That makes sense.
back in
Yeah.
that day, they didn't have recordings. So they might listen to an opera that was very famous, or a symphony. And not every city had symphony orchestras. And, certainly there was no internet back then. So there would be no way to hear that piece. So the composer might make a piano arrangement of that piece, and often a very
Yeah.
difficult arrangement. So then somebody at home could play that piece, and it's a transcription of that opera, or that maybe
So we
just
would
an
call that
aria.
like I would think of that as a piano reduction, but that makes
Yeah,
sense.
kind of. I mean, so I would say there's a little difference between a piano reduction for like an orchestral score, where you obviously can't play everything that's in the orchestra in the piano part. So a lot of concerti have the piano reduction of the orchestra, and it's very awkward sometimes because the people that write those, they just put everything in they can, and it's not very pianistic. But
Yeah.
this is a little bit more nuanced, or I think the composer's done a little bit more to recreate some of the effects, or to make it pianistic, so it functions as a showpiece or as a wonderful piece on the piano, and it's not really lacking. You don't hear it and think, "Oh gosh, I wish there was a bassoon, or I wish there was a voice in here." It's sort of self-contained. So
Well said, Elias. I would add just a little bit that transcriptions, you're maybe talking about a very broad category that would encompass something basic, like which would be an arrangement, versus Liszt, who took it and turned it into an entire form where you could have what he called paraphrases, or he
mhm,
had fantasies on let's say Don Juan of Mozart, in which case he would take themes from an opera and he would dress them up and embellish them in really a lavish way um, that encompassed all of the resources of the piano's ability to be brilliant, to be expressive. And so when you think about Liszt, and then some of the people who followed him, Rachmaninoff, Leopold Godowsky, Horowitz more recently, and many people
mhm,
today, um,
mhm.
they took sometimes themes, and there's a range. Sometimes it's close. Like Liszt might take a Schubert song and it'll essentially have the same form as the song, but he'll embellish it and dress it up much more. And then you have some pieces that really are only taking themes, and from that list is essentially creating an original piece that just makes use of these themes.
Yeah, yeah.
So that it's a very, very broad category,
Mhm.
and again, we have a very vast number of these pieces. A lot of them are available, but many of them are much more rare and more difficult to get your hands on.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And Elias, as you're and then back to kind of the scores, as a performer, when you're preparing a piece, how often are you trying to find alternative scores and different ways to that either different publishing houses or different
Mhm.
editors have worked on music, and where, how does that play a role in as a performer?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk forever, and maybe even get into Max's story a bit there, how we overlapped, because I think both Max and I, and you too, it's important to have different sources and different scores and different recordings to listen to at different points in the process. When we had Daniel Shapiro on, we were talking about, when do you listen to the recording? When do you look at a different score? You want to develop your own ideas first, but you also have to have some groundwork. So, um, the way I actually got into IPAM, and I'll say, when I was a student, there were only a handful of us that really. I did my master's at UMCP, University of Maryland, College Park, and there were only a handful of us that really, I would say, went there pretty regularly. And Max, of course, you were already working. I think you were already full time when I was a student,
Yes.
or you were just, yeah. And Don was there, and he would show me something new that he was interested in, kind of like a giddy little little boy in a candy store. But I'd say, okay, let me hear this, and I would be curious too, if Max, you can share some figures or numbers. Some of the recordings that you get are like one of a kind, or one of two in the world, and quite expensive. So I
Yes.
might hear something in a room that's isolated, sound isolated, and I can't record anything, of course, and that was all very very, I don't know, controlled, let's say. And that was great. So I got to hear something that really nobody else or only a few other people had ever heard before. But I went there on almost a weekly basis and looked for different recordings of pieces, different editions of scores in something I was preparing. And it really did influence me. It did affect me while I was there. I was there 03 to basically 05, 06. And I kind of developed a rapport with both Don and with Max. And it was just a great time. I loved the resource. You mentioned Harold Schoenberg before with the book that he wrote, which I would recommend to all pianists and piano students and teachers to read. I actually remember when you got his collection when he passed away of CDs, and a lot of them were duplicates. So what ended up happening is to raise some funds, I believe IPAM sold some of them, and I bought something like 300 CDs from you guys. Wow. Because Don gave me a very good, I think I paid $4 or $5 for them. And some of them are signed, Harold, dear Harold, something, wow. Thanks for coming to my concert, from Raymond Lewenthal, or from, I don't know if I have one signed from Vladimir Horowitz. I don't think so. But, I have a couple signatures in some of those. And that was just very special for me. And that's why I have such a huge CD collection. And one of the reasons I bought some scores from there too, and I worked in a music store in Silver Spring. That's one of the reasons I have such a vast score collection that I'm proud of, and why I think that's so important when I teach and I have a student that's playing something. I can show them 4 or 5 editions of that and discuss, well, what are these differences and why does Chopin have 3 editions of a piece? Oh, well, because he sent one of his pieces to a publisher in France, one to a publisher in England, one to Germany. And so, or one of his students sent a copy of it. I think that's fascinating to learn the history of the piece and why we make certain artistic choices when we play it. And so, I don't know, that's my long story as to why IPAM was actually a huge, important resource for me in my development at just that right time, I think, when I needed it. So,
that's great. Thanks for saying that. I actually, when I think of the time that you were there, for Don and I, we often talk, and that was like
the golden era.
It really was. It really was in terms of the involvement. It was. I think you might be undercutting it a little bit because there were more of your. There was a larger handful of between yourself and your classmates of piano majors there that were making use of IPAM than we've seen subsequently. And again, I think part of that is due to the rise of some of these internet phenomenons like YouTube and IMSOP, and people say, well, who cares? I can just sit at home and I can just get access to all these resources. So you guys really, when I think of that period of time, you guys, in terms of being curious, I really remember all of you very fondly. It's like, oh, well, we get
Margarita, Elliot, Matt.
Yes.
Steve, Nico. Yeah.
We get people coming from literally not only different parts of the country, but different parts of the world to do research. And it's just always amazed Don and myself that we get that, and then we have most of the student body who are not curious enough to darken our doorstep. And I think that's just, I mean, yes, maybe it's partially due to the availability of a lot of things, but I do think a lot of it is a lack of curiosity. And I think going back, to former days, when you had to go to an archive or go to the Library of Congress, or there was more grit and determination and curiosity in terms of researchers, because you really had to look for stuff. And now I think with this availability, I think people are a little bit more lazy. Maybe that's not such a nice word, not a pretty word, but I think there's a complacency in terms of curiosity.
Well, that was YouTube was really just starting. I don't
Yes.
know exactly when it
Yes.
started, but we're kind of the internet. I'm maybe a little younger, but I remember when internet was just coming into the fore, and we got an email in high school and stuff. And okay, I'm not that old,
Right.
but still, that just wasn't accepted, or it wasn't understood that was just normal. It was kind of new, and you still
Yeah.
went to the library. I remember in middle school, one of my teachers wrote a book on researching at the library, and we all had to go on a scavenger hunt in our school library.
Yes.
And that was just a thing: card files and microfiche and microfilm, and
Yes.
and it can be. I mean, at the time, I was like, I hate microfiche. I don't want to look at. But later, I did have that curiosity of, oh, this is something that's rare, that's only been preserved this way, and I'm not going to get it online. And often the digital versions of things are not as good, as crisp, as clean, and you're not, when you're listening to something online, it's often passive. You're not really fully engaged as you are
Yes.
in a soundproof room with the best speakers in the world.
Absolutely.
It's something else to experience that, and I'm glad that I kind of was growing up around that day and age. I have a cute story if we have time. If you'll indulge me, do you
Yes.
mind?
Yes.
So I was
Absolutely.
preparing, and this is not a knock on anybody, by the way. It's just kind of cute that it happened this way. So I think Max, you remember I was very particular with my scores in
Uh-huh.
my copying of them, and at that time, if I kind of had that OCD streak, if there's even a little bit of black from the copier, a line or a streak, I had to white it out and recopy it, and then not worry about the degradation of the. Anyway, so I made all these meticulous scores so I wouldn't ruin the originals. I bought all these Henley covers for my scores, and I happened to be playing the Les Jeux de la Ville d'Est by
Yes.
Liszt, and it's about 15, 16 pages long, something like that. But one of the pages, and it's in the middle of a book, because it's in the middle of a année de pèlerinage. It's a
Yeah.
set. So I don't know. It's like page 23 to 42, and I, by accident, I don't know. I had copied it, and I'd been playing it and memorized it. This was going to be on my final master's degree recital. And about a week, I'd played it for my teacher a few times. I'd played in studio class. I'd played it for my friends, and then I went to IPAM to listen, and Don said, "Oh, I've got this new recording that we just got from, I don't know who it was, but it was a live recording, and it was amazing. It was fantastic." But what got me is around the third page, they did something. I was like, "Oh, that's so interesting what they added there." And about 5 seconds later, I thought, "Wait, I actually play that too, but somehow I play it later than they do." And then later in the piece, like 30 seconds later, I said, "Oh, they kind of went back to the place that I played earlier." Then I realized that I had copied the pages 22, 23, 24, 26, 25, 27, 28, 20. And the beginning of page, I think it was 25 and 26, were the same chord, and the endings were very similar, if not the same, but they both led in different directions. So I had memorized the piece with one of the pages reversed, and I'd given that my score to everybody. So they kind of followed, like, "Oh, this looks right to me." And nobody
Oh,
mentioned that you've learned the piece wrong with one page reversed. And so that was a week before my master's recital.
oh.
And now we know how history gets corrupted, ladies and gentlemen.
So I told Don, I was like, "Thank you very much. I have to relearn this. I have to flip the page." And luckily I did. It was a very, very easy change, because I mean, it's the same intro and outro basically on the page. So there's no problem. But
But you know what? You might be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be, Elias. But some people have published recordings when they've made that error. We have published
oh, wow.
recordings when people have misread the score, read the wrong clef, reversed pages, things
Wow.
like that, in published recordings. So I'm not going to name
Wow.
any names right now.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow. Yeah, I'm
hey,
glad.
I want to say a couple of more things, and then maybe we can go into a handful of performances by our mystery performer
Yeah.
that I've pulled up. And one of them is just to follow up with the thing about performer editions. And of course, in the middle part of the 20th century, there was this move towards urtext, just
Mhm.
fidelity to whatever the composer wrote. We don't want to have any editorial commentary from
Mhm.
whoever this performer was. And look, I think there's a huge amount of value with that, because you want to know, okay, um, what did the composer write? Now, that's not always an easy question to
Mhm.
answer, just as you were kind of pointing out, Elias, because Chopin is a good example of someone who would publish a work in different places, and there'll be differences,
Yeah.
you know. But anyway, I think, again, when it comes to IPAM and IPAM's mission and having these performer collections, here's how I think about it. This is just my take on it. Think about if you were playing, let's say, the Beethoven Appassionata, and you have a lesson with Ignaz Friedman and with Carl Friedberg and with Moritz Rosenthal, and they all had different things to say about it, you
Mhm.
know. And so I think essentially with a published score, you're getting a printed or written commentary on the thoughts of somebody who was a great performer, who had
Mhm.
some sort of a relationship to the piece. I think as long as you can draw the line and you
Mhm.
understand where what's written in what the composer wrote, and where that leaves off, and where the
Yeah,
interpretive idea of
where
the editor.
Beethoven ends and Rosenthal begins.
Yes, as long as you
Yeah.
can do that, I think the insights, to my mind, are very valuable. Why would you not want to have the insights of someone who was of that stature?
Mhm.
So I think
Yeah.
there is a lot of value in terms of that type of thing. Um,
Well,
yeah.
the other
So
thing, I mean, we've talked about how to interpret with many different guests on here. Tom Posen, because he's doing this whole Beethoven project, and like you say, it's very hard to figure out what did the composer actually write, because there might be different versions, and then what did the composer write and what did he mean, because at that time it might have meant something different. Do we
that's
put
right.
ourselves in that headspace or not? Some of the tempo markings we talked about with Chopin. I know you've had Wim Winters on before talking about his theory, and then we might have CDs that sort of contradict that as well. I mean, it's a lot of discussion out there, and it's a lot to parse. And I think the best performers and scholars out there are ones who are willing to skirt that line and kind of play with it and try different things, add their own interpretation, as you will,
Yeah.
while remaining true to the composer. And so that I think, the criticism of some pianists, I'll take Glenn Gould as an example. Somebody will pan him and say, well, I don't really hear Bach, I hear Gould. And it's like, well, you might, but at the same time, maybe Bach would have loved that. And maybe he'd come back today, reincarnate, and say, oh, this is exactly, or this is the way I want it to be heard today. So,
Right.
but
Or
but
this
then
is
it gets a
or this is the
discussion
way
of
that I would want Glenn Gould to play it. Like,
right.
that's the thing is there is a symbiotic relationship
Yeah.
that is between composer and performer all the time.
Yeah, now
Yeah.
that doesn't mean every interpretation is valid, and we've talked about, okay, does being a professional make you automatically have a valid interpretation? No. Does being a student make you have an invalid interpretation? No. I mean, there's got to be some searching and soul searching and listening to authorities and conventions and traditions, but sometimes you've got to break those too.
Well, and then in addition to all of that, we have to realize that when a composer published a piece, that's the composer's idea at that moment in time. That
Hmm.
doesn't preclude the possibility that they might have felt differently about the piece, in terms of its possibilities, in terms of dynamics or whatever, or even some notes.
Yeah.
Oh,
10 years later, I mean, because like, for instance, when you read, what is that book, the Chopin book, Eicheldinger, Chopin as Pianist
Oh,
and
Eicheldinger,
Teacher.
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, he has all these stories in there of Chopin's pupils working with him, and him
Hmm.
adding ornaments, and him
Hmm.
adding, all sorts of things to the score, and saying, no, play it this way, and it's
Hmm.
different from what he published in the score. And
Hmm.
I mean, even if you think about it from our point of view as performers, if you learned a piece I mean, we're old enough now. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
20 years ago. Wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
you feel differently about it today? You
Yeah,
know,
for sure.
I would think that if you don't, if you play it exactly the same way, there's probably something stale that's occurring in terms of our interaction with the piece. And I think it's probably similar. There's so many examples with composers, you know, someone like Liszt, for instance, who, you know, in the case of his pupils, who are all, you know, the most talented pianists in Europe at that time, in
Mm-hmm.
most cases, he essentially gave them carte blanche to just, you know, if he trusted their in artistic instincts, he
Mm-hmm.
let them do all sorts of things with the music.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
know, and I know that's a different era, and I'm just saying, as we um, think about interpretation, especially of 19th century um, composers and performers, that's part of it, you know. And so when we hear these pianists from the olden times, the earliest recordings, they have a great deal more liberty than what we generally have today. So who are we to, I would say, impose a late 20th century or 21st century framework onto it, when in the 19th century they didn't play it that way. They thought there was a lot more freedom and leeway given to the performer when they approached the score.
And I think that's a perfect entry into these selections that you have sent us,
Yes.
which I'm very excited to
Mm-hmm.
to get into. So let's talk about some of these things that you sent.
Okay. All right. Well, let's see. This performer, well, let me just say by way of intro, one of the things that IPAM is very active in is supplying the material for the publication of various uh, performances. And in many cases, uh, you know, these are rare recordings. And well, I'll say that IPAM itself does not, at this point, we haven't produced a recording in a long time, but we supply the materials and we partner with different recording companies that do this. I would name Marston
Yeah.
Records, Ward
Ward
Marston.
Marston. Yeah.
If you're not familiar with him, your listeners, go and listen to or check out the selections on marstonrecords.com. The other one would be APR Records, which is in England and run by Mike Spring. And these two are at the forefront of the reissue of historical recordings. And so that's one of the main things we do, because a lot of these records are rare, and in some cases they're one of a kind, and we have them at IPAM. I want to say just one tiny thing, Mike, before I let you play the recordings, and maybe we won't have time to listen to all of them, but I did want to say this. We all appreciate the convenience of YouTube, the fact that you can go on YouTube and you can hear just about anything. What I really have a problem with is when some people, and Elias, you know, you've produced CDs. It's not a cheap thing to do.
No.
And when you're putting out this expense, and even when you're talking about the classical music world, and in particular the historical recordings, you're talking about a very small market. So if somebody takes your recordings and swipes them and posts them on YouTube, you're taking away from an already small market of sales that, you know, because this costs a lot of money to produce some of these recordings. And somebody takes them, and the person, you know, they'll be like, oh, well, I don't have to buy that. I can just go to YouTube.
Uh-huh.
I have a problem with that, because what you're really doing over time is you're undermining those record companies that are giving us these recordings. And eventually they're not going to be viable anymore, because they can't sustain what they're doing, because people are basically stealing their work and putting it on YouTube.
Yeah.
I have a big problem with that. So I'll just say, for any of your listeners who are fans of historical recordings, go to marstonrecords.com, go to APR, and check out their wonderful, wonderful catalog of historical piano recordings, and support those companies by buying them. You get a beautifully packaged set. You get comprehensive historical notes just telling you about the performer, the recordings, etc. Wonderful transfer work of these recordings, etc. Let's listen to this recording.
What by the way, and I have to add, what a beautiful gift for Christmas. Just want to throw that out there.
Put that in the stocking, some of these historical recordings.
Yeah.
This performer we are going to listen to.
Now, I haven't heard him yet, but Mike knows who it is, and so I
don't know who it is. No,
you don't
know.
Oh, okay.
I have it under selection 1, selection 2.
I hid it from him, Elias.
Oh, good. Okay. I was going to say I didn't look at that part of the email, so
yeah.
I want to try to guess.
I'll give you a broad historical outline that he was born in Vienna in 1911, and he took some lessons with Moritz Rosenthal. He is not very well known today. Some connoisseurs who maybe are record collectors would know his name, but he had an excellent and long career, and the connoisseurs tended to know who he was. And so when he gave any of his many recitals, the ones in the know would be there. Harold Schonberg was a great admirer of his playing. So how about we listen to the first one.
Okay, just let me know when you want to stop. We're going to stop it there.
Okay.
Whoa. Oh, by the way, I just want to say for a historical recording, that was well recorded.
Yeah. Now let me just I'll just let the cat out of the bag. Does the name Robert Goldsand have you heard that name, Elias?
I've heard the name, but
yes.
Yeah, I would not have guessed that.
Yeah. He had quite a reputation, admired by Harold Schonberg and many other people. As far as I know, well, I'm pretty sure. I think because this is going to be a part of an upcoming CD production on Marston Records, a 3 CD set. And Don wrote the notes. And as far as I know, if I remember correctly from his notes, there has been no CD issue of Robert Goldsand's playing.
Oh,
Hmm.
wow.
He made several LPs, and including some rare repertoire, like he was the first person to record the Chopin First Sonata in C minor. But he had a vast kind of varied repertoire of well-known things, but not so well-known pieces. And he's kind of a combination of throwback romanticism, but sort of more contemporary in terms of his relation to the score.
Hmm.
He's all of these recordings, I believe, are all going to be live performances. And what happened was he did agree to have all of his starting in the 1950s. He had all of his recitals recorded, and when he died, there were left all of these reel-to-reel tapes that were in abominable condition, mold and mildew and all sorts of things. And the recordings did come to IPAM, and we had one of our sound engineers that we partner with. His name is Seth Winter, one of the best in the business, and he worked on these tapes not just from a preservation point of view, just to get all the mold off of them. It was a long process, and then to extract the digital recordings. But we're going to have a 3 CD set on Marston Records of Gold Sand live performances, and he's one of these artists who played well enough in his studio recordings, but when he got in front of an audience, he tended to play with a great deal more freedom and liberty. So watch out for that sometime around the turn of the year.
Oh,
Okay.
fantastic.
That's cool.
That's
Yeah.
exciting. Yeah. So, and by the way, before we get on to anything else, I want to say, or ask, if somebody wants to support IPAM or wants to, help out in any of these projects or endeavors, what's the best way for them to do that?
Okay. Well, that should be a real simple question to answer, but in terms of looking us up, we just had a migration of our website. And so we're kind of a work in progress. So I would say the easiest way to find the IPAM website is to simply Google International Piano Archives at Maryland. I could tell you the address, but it's a little bit involved. It's not as simple as it used to be.
Max, if you put if you can maybe just email me the link, I'll put it in the description. So if anybody's listening to this and wants to check it out, they can just click on the description and go right to the website.
Yeah, and I'll send you something for Marston Records and APR also, because again,
fantastic.
We partner with them very regularly in terms of supplying recordings. At this point in time, many of the really well-known historical figures like Godofsky and Hoffman and Rachmaninoff and Horowitz, they've all these recordings are out there, but there's still a lot of other performers who are lesser known, and there's still a lot of work to be done with many of them.
Elias and I have talked about that, about how there are so many great performers that we just, we don't listen enough to, that aren't out there. So that's exciting.
And I have the Godofsky ones that Don and Ward Marston produced.
Yes.
I think that whole set. Nice series.
And I'll say also that just in terms of not just the historical pianists, but in terms of recordings that are being made today, we have had some hand in some research and other things. And again, Elias, you'll know one other friend of ours who's just done the complete Abram Chasins. This would be Margarita Gleboff, who's a fantastic pianist. And Abram Chasins, we have the Chasins collection at IPAM. He's a person who wrote a good amount of piano music, who a 20th century composer who wrote in more of a romantic style. And she just completed recording all of his works. Don's going to supply the excellent notes for that, and that's going to come out early next year.
Wow.
There's also some projects involving Alexander Zalotti, whose collection we have at IPAM. And he wrote many transcriptions, and many other performer editions. And he's someone who's starting to be explored these days. So that's just giving you a taste of some of the things that researchers are exploring at IPAM. There have been a few people who've come by recently to write books. One guy has come a few times recently to he's going to write a pretty comprehensive book on American pianists. And he's been by a few times because we have several great collection of several great American pianists at IPAM. And we've actually had two different researchers come this year who hope to write books on the Polish pianist Jan Smeterlin, who is not very well known, but he did for instance, a complete Chopin nocturne. He studied with Godowsky, and he was considered one of the great Chopin pianists of his time, but he's not very well known. And well, like I said, it's just kind of a coincidence that two people this year have come by to do research on him.
I think Mark Ainley we've had him on a couple times, and I think I've talked to him or he mentioned that name before. That's the first time I'd heard it.
Yes.
Well, I'm feeling very sad because our time is kind of far spent, Max. I don't want to cut this short. I hope that you'll come back on with us sometime and we can talk more, because I think this is a really important and fascinating subject.
Yes.
And your work is really important.
Well, you guys were not lying. It's kind of like you start talking and next thing you know, you look at the clock. And here I am, and I'll just say to your listeners, I mean, I supplied four recorded selections. I'm sorry we couldn't even get through one of them.
As long as you promise to come back on, we'll get through.
We'll get through the other ones. Yeah,
I'm happy to hold on to them.
It's been fun, and anyway, I just wanted to give you a taste. There's a real great range in these series of recordings by Gold Sand, and again, I just wanted to present that because I'll say for sure these recordings you will not find on YouTube, at least not now. Because nobody has access to them. They're on reel tapes that are at IPAM, and that was my whole point in presenting it. That there's still a lot of material that you have no other way of getting at, and if you undermine the industry, then you make it less possible for people to continue to produce these recordings. Because you got to pay an engineer, you got to do all this stuff. And if you can't afford it, then guess what? All those recordings are going to stay on the shelf and nobody's going to hear them.
So only a few people, you and Don and a few others there in person had heard these recordings. And now that it's on our show, it will go out to our billion listeners.
That's right.
That's right.
Eat your heart out, Joe Rogan.
Well, and that's right. Instead of waiting for it to come on YouTube, just go out and buy the Gold Sand set out of Ward Market.
Go do that. Support those. Get that recording. That sounds like such an interesting recording, and I had never heard of them, and I'm really impressed with what I heard. The little bit I heard is just really beautiful playing. Yeah.
Next time you come on, maybe we can actually parse it or talk about his playing a little bit and pick it apart and see why it's that confluence of the two different approaches, which I could sense. And I think that'd be fascinating to talk about.
And we could play more of, name that performer.
That's tough.
Prize going out to the audience members who can guess.
That's right.
Yeah, we'll do a call-in part of the show. Who was that?
Hey, Max, this has been a delight. Thanks a million for coming on. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
You are listening to And If Love Remains.
The first of 23 installments requested by Dr. Levitt. Trying to be in compliance here because we're taking him and that whole organization